Parliament.
The Prime Minister was asked to respond to comments from a senior advisor to the Indonesian Vice President, who's currently visiting Australia. Last night on 7:30, Dewa Fortuna Anwar expressed dissatisfaction with the Australian government's approach. She also indicated Jakarta was in talks with Canberra about exchanging refugees in Indonesian detention centres for asylum seekers trying to reach Australia by boat.
They are talking about agreements. If Indonesia were to take them, the costs of the burdens will be borne by Australia, and then at the same time Australia will take the same number of people that are already sitting in detention centres in Indonesia, and that they will be processed.
One of the things that I'm not going to do, and one of the things that no government should do if it wants to get the best possible outcome for the Australian people, is engage in negotiations with another country, dare I say it, through the media.
What on earth is going on with the boats policy? How is it that we've managed to get our nearest, largest neighbour so offside that they're commenting and directly contradicting our own government's policies? It's time that the government owned up to what's really going on.
The opposition also pursued the twin issues of immigration and secrecy.
Is there information currently in the possession of the Minister which he will provide to his weekly media briefing tomorrow, which he's unwilling to provide to Parliament today?
Madam Speaker, I have no information within my folder here which goes to the matters.
How many Indonesian fishing boats has the government bought since the election?
Well, again, it's an operational matter, Madam Speaker.
Continues on an operational matter.
The opposition interrupted question time to condemn the government's policies.
The only defence he's got is, it's not in my folder. Not in my folder.
We are stopping the boats. We said we would stop the boats. It was those opposite who set the boats running.
The Minister's next weekly briefing's due tomorrow.
Indonesia's rescue agency is calling into question Australia's version of what happened in last week's asylum seeker standoff. It says Australian authorities either towed or escorted the boat nearly 50 nautical miles back towards Indonesia.
There was a boat near the Christmas Island, and the Navy escort them and pushed back to Indonesia territory.
The account is at odds with the Australian Immigration Minister's statement that the Navy did not turn back the asylum seeker boat. And for more, I'm joined live now by Indonesia correspondent George Roberts in Jakarta. George, can you expand for us what the Indonesians had to say today and what the Australian response has been?
Well, the Immigration Minister, Scott Morrison, has put a statement out, again reaffirming his side of the story, that this was not a towback operation, as he puts it, but a rescue operation. He says that the boat at initial contact, as he calls it, was 43 nautical miles off the Java coast, although we haven't had an explanation as to whether initial contact means the first phone call they made to Australian rescue authorities or the HMAS Ballarat arriving on the scene. Nevertheless, Indonesia's Basarnas head of evaluations, Yopi Haryadi, who you saw there, says that Australia's version of events is not fitting with what the information they were getting from a merchant ship that was in the area, which said that the location that Australia said the boat was at was not where the boat was at. So Indonesia says that it was intercepted 107 nautical miles offshore and then brought 50 nautical miles closer by Australian authorities towards Indonesia as they were having that standoff over whether Indonesia would take the asylum seekers. Now, also, Basarnas has confirmed that last month, in response to Australia's new government and the policy of trying to get Indonesia to take asylum seekers back and accept returns, Indonesia has taken a tough approach to that. They've taken the decision of whether rescue authorities take asylum seekers out of the hands of rescue authorities. They've put that in the hands of the powerful super ministry, as we could call it, the Ministry of Politics, Law and Security, that oversees foreign affairs Affairs and Defence, and that decision is now a political decision whether to give clearance to Australian Navy and Customs ships to enter Indonesian waters. So it's escalated it into a political decision and a political stoush, no longer an operational decision.
And I understand from an operational perspective that the Indonesian Search and Rescue Service is looking at some reform. Can you tell us anything about that?
Yes, we were told today that Indonesia will seek at a meeting on the 21st of November to get support to have its search and rescue region made smaller because it just can't service the huge area that has been assigned to it. It goes beyond, lower than Christmas Island towards Australia. Indonesia's been involved in 47 search and rescue operations for asylum seekers in 2012. That number went up to 80 so far this year, and only in 10 to 20% of the cases has Indonesia been able to launch boats to get out because the waves are too big. It doesn't have the appropriate equipment or the right assets, as they call it, in the right areas. So therefore they say the area's too big, we can't deal with it, we need to be looking at a smaller zone, which would see Australia having to take more of that responsibility.
And just briefly, George, we heard earlier in the evening that a boat had sunk off the coast of Java. What's the latest on that story?
The latest we've heard from Ferry Krishna, who is from the Search and Rescue Organisation, is that they have managed to get 10 people off that boat. It turns out it wasn't sinking. It did have engine trouble. They were all Sudanese people on board, 51 people. There are now 41 people who are left to be brought ashore, but it seems it wasn't sinking. Initially, they refused to come off the boat, but it seems they've now started to remove them and bring them back to Indonesia.
George Roberts in Jakarta, thanks so much.
Parliament.
The Prime Minister was asked to respond to comments from a senior advisor to the Indonesian Vice President, who's currently visiting Australia. Last night on 7:30, Dewa Fortuna Anwar expressed dissatisfaction with the Australian government's approach. She also indicated Jakarta was in talks with Canberra about exchanging refugees in Indonesian detention centres for asylum seekers trying to reach Australia by boat.
They are talking about agreements. If Indonesia were to take them, the costs of the burdens will be borne by Australia, and then at the same time Australia will take the same number of people that are already sitting in detention centres in Indonesia, and that they will be processed.
One of the things that I'm not going to do, and one of the things that no government should do if it wants to get the best possible outcome for the Australian people, is engage in negotiations with another country, dare I say it, through the media.
What on earth is going on with the boats policy? How is it that we've managed to get our nearest, largest neighbour so offside that they're commenting and directly contradicting our own government's policies? It's time that the government owned up to what's really going on.
The Abbott government's asylum seeker policy has hit rough waters. A senior advisor to the Indonesian government is unhappy with the way Australia is dealing with asylum seekers. Dewi Fortuna Anwar advises the Indonesian Vice President, who's currently visiting Australia. Professor Anwar says Jakarta made it very clear to Australia that it wants close talks about asylum seekers and that one side should not impose its will on the other. The comments follow a standoff last week where Indonesia refused to accept 60 asylum seekers rescued by an Australian ship in Indonesia's search and rescue zone. The Prime Minister's also expressed frustration, saying he thinks Indonesia should have taken the boat back. Chief Political Correspondent Sabra Lane.
Well, welcome to this week's briefing on Operation Sovereign Borders. We don't comment on water operations, as you know. I'm not going into operational matters that put at risk current or future operations. We're not going to go into the micro detail. Others want to speculate what's happening in between these weekly briefings. They can do that, but you often get it wrong.
Since the election, the immigration ministers presented weekly updates on the government's policy to stop the boats. Under Operation Sovereign Borders, the government's rationed details, citing operational reasons, and dismissed the previous government's updates as shipping news for people smugglers. On Thursday, an Australian border protection vessel rescued a boat of asylum seekers in Indonesia's search and rescue zone. The secrecy continued at the minister's regular Friday briefing.
I'm advised that all people have been accounted for and in line with standard practice, I will not comment further on this or any other on-water issues.
Well, just to repeat what the Commander has said, he has made it very clear that Australia was involved in liaising with Indonesian authorities on this matter and that all the persons on the vessel have been accounted for.
Is there a standoff?
No, that's...
Are they on the way to Christmas Island now?
These matters continue to be dealt with in the practice we've been adopting for the last 8 weeks under Operation Sovereign Borders, and we'll continue to do it the way we've been doing it. And all the people have been accounted for. So we can go around this for a lot longer, but that is the position.
The position was a standoff. Indonesia refused to take the asylum seekers even though they were rescued in Indonesia's search and rescue zone.
Our geography is not our choice. Indonesia is on the way to Australia. These people passed through Indonesia, and Australian Navy intercepted the boat and then expect Indonesia to take these people back. They would be social burdens for Indonesia. They did not want to come to Indonesia.
The Minister says he's puzzled by Indonesia's actions.
There's no real rhyme or reason to it necessarily. I think this last instance became very problematic because it went very public. And that's why we've been so careful in our public comments not to run that sort of a commentary.
Indonesia sees it differently. The country's Vice President is currently touring Australia. Dewi Fortuna Anwar is his senior advisor.
Australia is a very big country in terms of geography. It's a very wealthy country and a country where, the population is relatively small and built up by immigrants. This is always going to be a honeypot for people coming from other countries.
Earlier today, the Prime Minister said that Indonesia should have taken the rescued group.
These people were in a search and rescue situation in the Indonesian search and rescue zone. Now, the normal international law is that if you are rescued in a country's search and rescue zone, that country has an obligation to take you.
Well, I think it's plain that the government's tow back the boats policy is in tatters.
Can you confirm that Indonesia has asked us, has denied requests to take 2 more boatloads of people that were intercepted on the weekend?
These are matters that I'll leave to the Minister for Immigration.
Jakarta has made it very clear that we will like to talk very closely about this, and it should not just be one side imposing its will on the others.
It's also clear the recent revelations about spying from Australia's post in Jakarta have added to an already inflamed situation.
It's mind-boggling why, Australia would be a party to these illegal activities. Clearly, that erodes trust, and I hope that it will not happen again. We are very concerned about this.
Parliament's return will be a real test for the government's strategy on limiting information to the public. For many ministers, question time will be their first opportunity since the election that they've been quizzed in public about their portfolios and decision-making. And the opposition's more than keen to prod the Immigration Minister for answers. A former Secretary of Foreign Affairs and a respected diplomat weighed in, saying if the government's serious about having a Jakarta focus rather than a Geneva one in foreign policy, it must elevate Australia's relationship with Indonesia to the most important bilateral relationship it has, to be on par with the United States.
I think it's a very long-term thing. I mean, the relationship with a complex neighbour like Indonesia tends to have ups and downs, as we've had in the past. But it's an ongoing thing which I think we must, whatever the government of the day is, should work on consistently. Now, I think, not spasmodically, but consistently. And I think we need a sort of change in our national psychology, really.
He says the country should have high-level, regular, formal and informal meetings on all aspects of the relationship and recognise for our northern neighbours boats are a low priority.
You have to realise that Indonesia has more than 100,000 refugees in camps, and it's for them it's the issue of boat people is not a big problem. I mean, for Indonesia, with all its other issues it's dealing with, it's less down the list of priorities than it is for us.
The former diplomat says the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister's recent trips to Indonesia have been well received in Jakarta and may well cancel out any lingering negative sentiments over the Immigration Minister's rhetoric.
Well, I think the Indonesians certainly don't welcome that aspect of our relations. They don't have never really agreed with, even when Rudd was the Prime Minister, with the concept of turning back the boats, or particularly towing back the boats, or anything the Indonesians would see as violating their sovereignty. Now, that they do not welcome and will not welcome. I would have hoped that with the election behind us, that would be in a sense recognised and softened, and maybe that will happen.
And we invited the Immigration Minister onto the program tonight for an interview. He declined.